All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, on Thursday, Biden gave a big primetime address marking the one-year anniversary of coronavirus being labeled a pandemic. We didn't cover it much here because, frankly, there wasn't all that much to say about it. It's a typical cautious, standard issue presidential speech, acknowledgments of loss, vague, encouraging words, typical centrist political stuff. But that didn't stop right-wing media and pundits from doing their darndest to turn it all into a highly scandalous affair. So what did they feed this time into the outrage machine? Well, it was largely a critique about Biden not taking questions from the press and him not showing enough unity by giving Trump credit for working on vaccine development. Here's Candace Owens taking a crack at these exact talking points.
Let me get your reaction to what you heard from President Biden on Thursday night. And he didn't give President Trump any credit, even though President Trump rolled back regulations and, of course, introduced warp speed to get those vaccines on the market.
Well, this is the privilege of the Biden administration. I mean, imagine being a president who never has to answer questions from the press. You can just make stuff up as you go along. This has been one of the more remarkable things about this administration is that they are not taking questions. Joe Biden has not taken any questions. They seem to be protecting him and insulating him from any critiques. And we are correct to call this out. Obviously, this was a major win of the Trump administration. But people are wondering, how is it possible that Joe Biden gets out there, he gives an entire speech, it's been 50 plus days, and he still has not taken any questions from journalists.
All right, so let me first talk about the substance here. Do I care whether or not Biden gave Trump credit for speeding vaccine development? No, I do not. Not at all, not a tiny bit. Presidents and other powerful elected leaders are not entitled to praise and ego stroking. And it is also hilariously rich to watch any of these Trump apologist types feign outrage about Biden not giving his political opponents credit, given that magnanimous sharing of credit is hardly a Trumpian trait. On the other hand, I actually think they have a substantive point when it comes to Biden's lack of availability to the press. It is a bad thing that Biden has gone longer than any president in 100 years without holding a press conference. People deserve to hear directly from their president, especially in a time of crisis like what we are in right now. I'd love to see him press on the filibuster, on the PRO Act, on minimum wage, on his administration's policies at the border. And yes, a lot of mainstream journalists are completely hypocritical in turning a blind eye to Biden's press stonewalling when the same behavior from Trump would have led to endless outrage and anguished cries about the breaking of norms. After all, democracy dies in darkness, does it not? But here's the thing. I also know, as a political matter, no one gives a shit. Not about bipartisan unity, not about Biden's number of press conferences. They care about the checks hitting their accounts and the vaccines hitting their arms. And frankly, no one should know better that Americans don't care about the norms and hidebound rules of Washington than the modern GOP. After all, their guy spent 4 years trashing every norm that Washington has ever known, and oftentimes it was one of his more appealing traits. Not only did it not hurt him, people delighted in watching him cross the line and witnessing a pearl-clutching meltdown from all the moralizers who pretend to be holier than thou. Look, some norms are good and some norms are bad, but Trump's GOP has been fully committed to the idea that all of them should be gleefully smashed and that the tears of liberals upset at this upending of convention should be consumed daily and with delight. So it is amusing to see the shoe on the other foot now, watching Republicans suddenly become the keepers of the good name of Washington, D.C. and its established traditions. Here's Sean Hannity and Kayleigh McEnany deeply concerned about the lack of bipartisan unity.
None of this happened under Joe's watch. Donald Trump did all of this. Reince is right. I believe if he's Mr. Unity, he could have said, you know what, Operation Warp Speed helped us a lot. But no.
Exactly. And you even have the New York Times pointing out that Biden is only here because of President Trump. Yes, the fake news New York Times. ABC News said Biden refuses to acknowledge what Trump has given him. You even have these liberal media outlets acknowledging the truth, but Biden can't tip his hat. Although his COVID advisor today went on Fox News and said, point blank, I tip my hat to the Trump administration. I'm grateful for what they've given us. So he won't acknowledge it, but his advisor who's pulling the strings will.
Sorry, guys. No one cared when Democrats were crying about norms, and no one cares now that you're doing it either. In fact, y'all tried the same playbook during the campaign, and it already failed. The most consistent attack on Joe Biden, other than the preposterous Trojan horse for socialism nonsense, was that he was hiding in his basement. The critique was basically that he wasn't campaigning in the correct way, in the traditional way, with big rallies and big speeches. Again, it was actually a critique that had some merit. As a substantive matter, he should have been more available and been challenged more by the press. But did anyone ultimately care? Did a single person change their vote because Biden was keeping a light schedule and sheltering in place for large stretches of the campaign? No, they did not. Biden's violation of campaign norms did not land whatsoever. They also tried on a norms-based critique on the relief bill as well, complaining it wasn't bipartisan. That also clearly did not work out. In fact, the bill has broad bipartisan support, just not with the ghouls here in Washington. Or you could think back to the Trump administration, the first impeachment. It was all about norms and guardrails and whether Trump corruptly intervened to thwart military aid to Ukraine. As Sagar pointed out here, people were so uninterested in these norms that they actually flocked to the GOP during the Ukraine Gate impeachment, leading to the highest Republican Party identification levels in years. So yes, in part, Biden being a boring white guy makes him harder to demonize. He stays pretty quiet and just doesn't really give them much grist for the outraged mill. But part of why they aren't moving the needle is because they are making the same mistake that Democrats made in their Trump critiques, hand-wringing about norms and guardrails when people care much more about healthcare and about wages. But, well, the Republican Party doesn't exactly want to get into a discussion about that now, do they? Sagar, I just find it really amusing that now all of a sudden they're the ones that are like, oh, the norms, how could you go so long without a press conference? And again, I actually think that's a legitimate point, but I also know it is not remotely what people care about right now.
It's something you and I care about.
Yeah.
And we should. And look, we'll talk about it to a limited extent, but come on. It's like you said, I think Biden's slogan of 100 million shots and 100 million, 100 million checks in banks, that is the most effective political slogan I've heard in a really long time.
I mean, he's the one, remember, that came up with Bin Laden is dead
Bin Laden
and GM is alive, which again was a really good slogan.
Not bad.
Yeah.
And look, this is the thing. It drowns out substantive criticism, especially coming from the right, because there isn't any, especially whenever it comes to the COVID relief bill. Their arguments are austerity-minded, which is only going to resonate in a deep red state when they're like, they bailed out, California. And most people are like, look, man, I also got to check at the same time, so I don't really give a shit.
Right.
And that's just something that for real, this is how it works. And this is how it is going to go all across the administration, which is that on the Republican side, what is their critique here about press? This is like whenever the Obama folks were like, actually, the economy is good because of what we did. Yeah, maybe. But you know what? Trump's president. He gets credit for it, whether it's just or not. They also they also fall whenever there's a depression on their watch. That's how it goes. It's American politics. So if Biden is going to sit there and going to take credit, he won the election. I mean, he's the one who ramped up vaccine production. On a substantive level, did Operation Warp Speed contribute? Yeah, it did. Great. Congratulations. You probably should have run on that more whenever you're running for president.
How about that?
You had a chance. You had your chance, and you lost. And I cannot stand this whining every time it comes from Democrats or from Republicans. If you really want to critique the Biden people, there's plenty to work with. But they're just not doing it. And they're doing it in such a way where their base will eat it up. But in terms of actually swinging anybody on a substantive point, get out of
I don't
here.
even think their base really cares that much.
Yeah,
I mean, we cover how at CPAC, Biden lines
Yeah.
had very little energy behind them. And so what they're dying for him to do is to jump into one of these culture war fights, like Dr. Seuss.
Because they were goading him.
Right.
Obama always took the bait.
They're dying to get him
Yeah.
wrapped up into one of those things because right now, that's the only thing that they really have that has juice among their base and also among a broader public. That's not just isolated to the hardest core MAGA Republican base. They're dying for him to jump into that, and he is just not taking the bait. So the only way to criticize him would be on the substance. But they don't have a critique of him on the substance. They don't have one. They don't have the only critique of him on the substance would probably come from the left. Things like, oh, you just abandoned the minimum wage. You just didn't even bother to fight. You were disingenuous about the way that you promised $2,000 checks immediately. That's not ultimately what came. But they're not going to make any of those cases.
Yeah.
Hey, where's your health care plan? What happened to that, buddy, that you were talking about on the trail? But they're not capable of making any of those arguments. So they end up in this place and just hoping and praying that eventually he steps into one of these culture war fights. That's kind of where they are right now.
I mean, it's a danger. Look, maybe he will. He's got pretty good instincts whenever it comes to this stuff, and I would not bank the political future of my party on that, but that seems to be what they want to do.
Indeed. All right, coming up, our friends Roger Fisk and Rachel Bovar join us for Team Rising when Rising returns.